At precisely 5:30 every morning, long before the sun peeked over the rooftops of Boston, Lily was already unlocking the doors to Marlowe's Diner, a cozy, old-fashioned breakfast joint tucked away on the quieter end of Tremont Street. The air always smelled like freshly ground coffee and warm cinnamon toast, and Lily had grown to love that scent. It reminded her of the small comforts she clung to in a life that hadn't been easy. At 25, Lily carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had long since learned how to navigate hardship. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was just 10, and from that moment on, it had been her grandmother who raised her, a strong, gentle woman who taught her how to be kind even when the world wasn't. Now her grandmother was bedridden in the hospital, and Lily was doing everything she could to keep up with the bills, waitressing full-time, skipping meals, walking instead of taking the bus, anything to make sure her grandmother had what she needed. She never complained. Her coworkers often said Lily had an old soul. She was the type who always said yes, sir, or thank you, ma'am, who held doors open for strangers and never checked her phone while talking to someone. She noticed when a customer looked sad, when an old man's hand shook too hard to stir his coffee, or when a woman sat too long at a table without ordering, just needing a place to feel less alone. But more than anything, Lily had a deep and unwavering respect for the elderly. "They've walked farther roads than us," she once told a regular. "The least we can do is walk a few steps with them." It wasn't the kind of thing that got attention. No headlines, no applause. Just a young woman, every day, quietly choosing grace. And that's why, on one rainy morning when a frail old man came in with nothing but a pocketful of change and a hunger in his eyes, Lily didn't hesitate. She smiled at him, and the entire course of her life began to change. It was one of those Boston mornings where the sky couldn't quite decide whether to drizzle or just hang low and gray. The sidewalks shimmered with thin puddles, and the city seemed to move a little slower beneath the weight of the weather. Inside Marlowe's Diner, the warmth of clinking dishes and faint Motown playing on the radio wrapped the place in a comforting stillness. Only 2 booths were occupied that early, and Lily was humming softly as she wiped down the counter, lost in the rhythm of a routine she knew by heart. Then, the bell over the door jingled. Lily glanced up, towel in hand. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man, small and hunched against the cold, his coat too thin for the chill. Raindrops glistened on the shoulders of his worn tweed jacket, and his shoes, cracked along the soles, left a faint trail of moisture on the tile floor. He looked to be about 80, maybe older, face lined deeply with time, cheeks pale from the weather, hands trembling slightly as he removed his cap. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though every joint needed a moment to cooperate. Lily stepped out from behind the counter and offered him the gentlest smile. "Good morning, sir. Take any seat you like." The old man gave a small nod and chose a booth near the window, one that caught the morning light even on the gloomiest days. She brought him a menu, but he waved it off kindly, his voice gravelly yet warm. "Just a cup of coffee, and maybe a slice of toast, if that's all right." Lily nodded. "Of course. I'll have that right out." She could tell he wasn't there for the food. Some people came just to feel human again, to sit in a place where someone said their name, remembered their coffee order, or simply asked how they were doing. And Lily never judged. She brought him a steaming mug and a small plate with 2 slices of toast, butter on the side, just how her grandmother used to like it. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite, sipping the coffee as though it warmed more than just his hands. No one else paid much attention, but Lily kept an eye on him in between refills and cleaning. He looked out the window as if he were waiting for something that would never arrive. When he was done, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small cloth pouch, tied loosely with a string. His fingers, knotted and stiff with age, struggled to open it. Then carefully, he began counting out coins, mostly nickels, dimes, a few pennies. He placed them on the table one by one, squinting, lining them up in neat little rows. It was slow. Painfully slow. From behind the counter, Lily saw a customer 2 booths over glance at their watch with visible irritation. A man waiting on his takeout order tapped his foot. But Lily didn't move. She walked over quietly, crouched down next to the booth so she was eye level with him, and said softly, "Let me help, sir. Your hands must be cold." He looked at her, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. These old fingers don't work like they used to." She smiled gently. "That's all right. Mine still do." He chuckled faintly, and Lily began counting the coins for him, grouping them by value, keeping her voice low and steady. When they finished, he was short, not by much, just 32 cents. He looked down, ashamed, and began to dig into his coat pocket again, but Lily placed a hand on his wrist. "That's just enough," she whispered. "You're good." Before he could protest, she slipped a few coins from her own apron pocket into the register and handed him his receipt. Then she walked to the kitchen, came back with a small paper bag, and placed it gently in front of him. "There's a blueberry muffin in there," she said. "On the house. For later." The old man blinked slowly, emotion catching in his throat. "You're very kind, young lady." Lily shook her head. "I've just had good teachers." She didn't know it then, but someone was watching from the far corner of the diner, someone whose life would soon collide with hers in a way she could never have imagined. The clinking of silverware and low murmur of early morning chatter filled the diner, but at table 5, time seemed to move at a different pace. The elderly man's fingers trembled as he fumbled with each coin, laying them out one by one, a nickel here, a dime there, 2 pennies rolled out of his reach and clinked against the edge of the table. He tried to reach them, but his hands weren't cooperating. His shoulders hunched lower with each passing second. From the corner of the room, a woman in a business suit let out an audible sigh. A young man waiting for his takeout order shook his head and muttered, "Come on," under his breath. The tension, subtle at first, began to build, little ripples of impatience spreading quietly across the room. Lily noticed it all. She had seen these moments before, when someone older moved too slow for a world that never paused. She didn't hesitate. She folded her towel, placed it gently on the counter, and walked toward the booth. Her steps were quiet, her face soft with calm understanding. She crouched down beside the table, so the man didn't have to crane his neck to see her. With a warm smile and the kind of voice one uses when speaking to someone they deeply respect, she said, "Chow Jupong Duok Chue? Taong Lan, de Chow Dem Cho." The old man looked at her, surprised. His eyes were cloudy with age but still carried that flicker of dignity, the kind that doesn't easily accept help. But something in her tone wasn't pity. It was care. Genuine, human, undemanding kindness. He nodded slowly, and Lily reached for the coins. She didn't rush. She counted each one out loud in a calm rhythm, grouping them by value, her fingers steady and sure. Every so often, she'd glance up and smile, as if to reassure him that he owed her nothing but his presence. When she finished, her brows furrowed slightly. They were 32 cents short. The old man noticed her pause and instinctively reached for his coat again. "I think I might have some more," he began, voice shaky. But Lily gently touched his hand. "No need, sir," she said softly. "Ve la vua du roi duong." Before he could argue, she slipped a few coins from her own apron pocket, turned to the register, and rang up the meal like everything was perfect. He sat still for a moment, looking at her as if unsure whether to feel grateful or guilty. She just smiled again and said, "Let me wrap something for you to take home." A few minutes later, she returned with a small brown paper bag, carefully folded at the top. "It's a blueberry muffin. Still warm," she said. "I thought you might want a snack later." He opened his mouth to protest, but she shook her head gently. "Don't worry. I made too many this morning." She hadn't, of course. But she wasn't about to let him leave empty-handed. Something about the way he sat, the way he folded his cap in his lap, told her he hadn't been shown simple kindness in a long while. The man stared at the bag, then at her, this young woman with gentle eyes and the patience of someone twice her age, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a small nod. "Thank you, miss. Folks like you are rare." Lily didn't answer right away. She just smiled again, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything in return. And just like that, the mood of the room shifted. The impatience dissipated. Conversations resumed. But someone from the far corner, a man in a quiet gray suit sipping coffee behind a newspaper, hadn't missed a single detail. He watched Lily as she walked back behind the counter, tying her apron once more, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But to him, and soon to Lily, everything had. From the farthest booth, tucked beneath the old clock that had ticked over Marlowe's counter since the early 60s, a man sat quietly with a black coffee and a folded newspaper. He wore a simple gray suit, nothing flashy, just well-fitted and clean, and his dark coat hung neatly beside him. He appeared to be just another early riser looking to avoid the rush. But Daniel Brooks wasn't there for the coffee. He had come to this little diner by chance. Or maybe, if he were honest, he had come because something in him was tired of boardrooms and silence. Ever since his mother passed away 2 months earlier, he found himself wandering, seeking places that felt real. His driver had dropped him off a few blocks away that morning without asking questions. He'd told his assistant to cancel all his meetings. He just wanted to be anonymous for a day. Daniel Brooks wasn't the kind of billionaire people recognized on the street. He kept a low profile, rarely gave interviews, and never flaunted his success. His fortune had been made in senior living developments, not glamorous, but necessary. He'd spent decades building communities that gave dignity to aging lives. But with his mother gone, that mission felt emptier. He had cared for her in her final years, sat beside her hospital bed as machines hummed and monitors blinked, and when she passed, a quiet hollowness had followed him like a shadow. He was staring into his coffee when the doorbell jingled and the old man stepped in. Something about the man's fragile walk, the thin coat, the way he held his cap, it caught Daniel's eye. He watched as the young waitress greeted him with warmth, no hesitation, no judgment. She treated him like he mattered. Not just a customer, a person. Daniel had seen too many people in his world pass the elderly by like they were invisible. He had sat in meetings where analysts reduced aging populations to profit margins. But here, in this quiet corner of Boston, he watched a different kind of economy unfold, one measured not in dollars, but in dignity. When the man began counting his change, Daniel felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. His mother's hands had shaken the same way. She used to joke about how coins slipped through her fingers like secrets. He'd taken her to breakfast once a week, and every time, she insisted on paying with exact change, even when he protested. "Let me hold on to the little things," she used to say. So when Lily knelt beside the old man and offered to help, Daniel leaned in. He watched her hands move slowly over the coins, saw how she didn't flinch when she realized he was short, how she slipped the extra change in without calling attention to it. And the muffin, that was what did it. That small, unnecessary act of kindness. That's when Daniel felt something shift. His throat tightened, and for a long moment, he couldn't look away. This young woman didn't know who he was. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't angling for a tip or recognition. She simply did what was right, with quiet grace, the kind that can't be taught in any school or bought in any store. He folded his newspaper, pushed his untouched coffee aside, and sat back in the booth. In his entire career, Daniel had written checks with more zeros than he cared to count. He had funded hospitals, built retirement homes, donated to universities. But in that moment, nothing had moved him quite like watching a tired waitress help an old man count his change, not because she had to, but because she believed he mattered. He didn't know what he was going to do yet. But he knew he wouldn't be leaving this diner the same man who walked in. 2 days passed. The drizzle had cleared, replaced by a bright, cold morning with sunlight streaming in slanted golden beams across the linoleum floor of Marlowe's diner. Lily was refilling the napkin dispensers when the bell above the door chimed again, a familiar sound, but today it made her pause. She turned just as the man in the gray suit stepped inside. He looked the same, calm, deliberate, and dressed like someone who didn't need to prove anything. He gave her a small, polite nod and walked to the booth beneath the clock, the very one where he had quietly watched her 2 mornings ago. Lily smiled, not recognizing him fully, but feeling a vague sense of familiarity. Customers came and went, but something about his presence lingered. She walked over with a menu, but he didn't reach for it. "Just coffee, please," he said. "Black." She nodded. "Coming right up." When she returned and set the mug in front of him, he didn't touch it right away. He was watching her closely now, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in the quiet, thoughtful way someone studies a puzzle before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. Lily raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "Sure." "Do you always treat elderly customers the way you did the other day?" Her hands stilled for a moment. Something flickered in her eyes, a flash of memory, of a thin hand gripping hers in a hospital bed, of soft, papery skin and warm Sunday morning hugs. She sat down on the edge of the booth across from him, wiping her hands with a dish towel. "I lived with my grandma after my parents passed," she said softly. "She raised me. The strongest person I ever knew. She used to say we're all going to be old one day, and how we treat the elderly now is how we're asking to be treated later." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Lily said. "Still is. She's in the hospital right now. I'm just trying to keep up with everything until she gets better." The man's gaze dropped for a moment. He stirred his coffee, though he hadn't added anything to it. Then he looked back at her. "You didn't have to do what you did for that gentleman. No one would have blamed you for moving along or asking him to hurry." Lily shook her head gently. "He reminded me of someone. That was enough." Daniel leaned back, watching her with the kind of focus that made time feel slower. "You know," he said, "in my business, people like to measure things. Success. Value. Efficiency. But I watched you give something the other day that doesn't fit into any spreadsheet." She blinked, surprised. "You were here." He nodded. "I saw everything. The change. The muffin. The way you smiled like it was no trouble at all." Lily looked down, suddenly a little shy. "Honestly, I just didn't want him to feel embarrassed. That's the worst part of getting old, I think. People treating you like you don't belong." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It softened his face in a way that made him look younger, less like a man who lived behind closed doors and more like someone who had once known pain and decided to do better. "Well," he said finally, "I think your grandmother would be proud. I know someone else would have been too." Lily tilted her head. "Someone else." He hesitated, then looked out the window, eyes far away. "My mother passed recently," he said quietly. "She loved diners. The simple ones. Said they reminded her of when life moved slow enough to taste your coffee." Lily felt something settle between them then, not silence, but shared understanding. A reverence for people who had shaped them and for the quiet legacy they left behind. "Well," she said gently, "then I'm glad you came in today." "So am I," he replied, and for the first time in a long while he meant it. The morning rush had started to build, and Lily was back behind the counter, pouring refills and greeting the regulars by name. But something about her conversation with the man in the gray suit lingered. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way he listened, or the gentle way he spoke about his mother. Either way, he had left a quiet mark on her already heavy day. She hadn't noticed when he'd slipped out. No goodbye, no wave. Just the soft jingle of the doorbell and the fading echo of his footsteps. It wasn't until the lunch crowd had slowed down that she returned to the booth where he'd sat. She picked up the empty coffee cup and was about to wipe down the table when she saw it. A plain, cream-colored envelope. It was tucked just beneath the sugar dispenser, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Her name was written on the front, Lily, in neat, deliberate handwriting. She paused for a moment, looking around the diner, but he was long gone. She opened it slowly, uncertain. Inside was a folded check. Her breath caught in her throat. $100,000. For a moment, she just stared at it, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe it wasn't real. But it was signed. Dated. Verified. There was no denying it. Her hands began to shake as she reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out a small handwritten note. The paper was thick, elegant. The handwriting strong, steady, the kind of script that belonged to someone who still valued the weight of a pen. Dear Lily. Thank you. You reminded me this morning of something I had forgotten, that there are still people in this world who do good without expecting anything in return. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know I was watching. And yet you chose compassion over convenience. Grace over judgment. That's the kind of person who changes the world in ways most never notice. This check is not a reward, it's a seed. Use it to plant whatever dream you once thought was too far away. Whether it's for your grandmother, or for yourself, or for someone who needs a second chance, let this be the beginning of something beautiful. With deepest respect. Daniel Brooks. Lily's eyes welled with tears. She read the note twice, 3 times, pressing it to her chest for a moment as the diner buzzed around her. She thought about the overdue rent notice folded in her purse. About the hospital bills piling up beside her grandmother's bed. About the bakery she had always dreamed of opening, the one she'd named years ago in a notebook, Grandma's Table. She wasn't used to receiving. Her life had been built on surviving, on doing what needed to be done without complaint. And now, here was this gift, not just the money, but the message behind it. Someone had seen her. Truly seen her. Not just a waitress. Not just another face behind the counter. But a human being who mattered. She looked back at the booth, now empty, the faint imprint of his coffee cup still visible on the table. It wasn't about the amount. It was about what it meant. That kindness, even when no one's watching, can echo louder than any headline. That somewhere, someone always notices. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes back to you in ways you could never imagine. Lily folded the letter carefully, tucked the check inside, and held it close. For the first time in a long while, her future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to run toward. The check cleared within 3 days, but Lily waited no more than a few hours to decide where the money would go. First, she paid the outstanding hospital bills, all of them. The moment she saw the balance drop to 0, she cried in the quiet hallway outside her grandmother's room. Not because the weight had lifted, but because she had grown so used to carrying it that she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Next, she found a space, an old storefront just a few blocks from the diner. It was worn and dusty, the windows clouded from years of neglect, but it had the kind of bones her grandmother would have loved. Big front windows, a squeaky wooden floor, and a kitchen large enough to fill with the smell of fresh bread and warm cinnamon rolls. She named it Grandma's Table. People in the neighborhood didn't ask too many questions. They just showed up the way they always had, curious, hopeful, hungry. And every Saturday morning, the front door would open a few minutes before 8, and the smell of coffee and buttermilk pancakes would drift down the street like an invitation. There were no prices on the menu that day, not for anyone over 65. Elderly couples came hand in hand. Veterans in old jackets sat quietly near the windows. Grandmothers in floral blouses chatted over fresh scones, and men who had long been forgotten by the world were offered second helpings without ever needing to ask. No one had to explain how little they had in their wallet. No one felt shame for asking. They simply came. And Lily served them all with a smile that reached far beyond the counter. Word spread quickly. People donated. Local bakers dropped off ingredients. Kids from the high school helped carry plates and refill coffee cups. Volunteers showed up just to say thank you. But Lily never let the place forget why it existed. Right behind the counter, mounted on the wall where everyone could see it, hung a small wooden sign carved by hand. The letters weren't perfect, but the message was. Be patient. One day, you'll be the one who needs someone to count the change for you. It stopped people in their tracks. It softened them. It made them stay a little longer, speak a little kinder, tip a little more. And Lily, the girl who used to wake before dawn, who once counted coins just to get through the week, now woke each morning to something new. Purpose. She still visited her grandmother every day. They sat together on the back porch of the care home, sipping iced tea in the late afternoons. Sometimes Lily would bring muffins, other times stories. But her grandmother always asked the same question. Are you taking care of others, baby? And Lily would smile and say, trying to, Grandma. Just like you taught me. She also began volunteering at the nearby nursing home. Reading, helping with meals, sometimes just sitting with someone who hadn't had a visitor in years. It wasn't part of a plan, it just felt like what came next. Like a continuation of a story she hadn't realized she'd been writing all along. She never saw Daniel Brooks again. But sometimes, when she unlocked the front door of Grandma's table in the quiet morning hours, she imagined him standing at that old booth by the window, sipping his black coffee, watching it all unfold. And in those moments, she hoped he knew just how far his quiet act of generosity had gone. Because sometimes, a life doesn't change in a single moment, but in a series of small ones. A hand extended. A coin slipped quietly into a till. A muffin given without charge. A letter signed with kindness. And sometimes, that's all it takes to turn one act of compassion into a lifetime of meaning. If Lily's story made you smile, leave a like to help share this quiet act of kindness with others. And if you believe that even the smallest act of compassion can change someone's life, hit subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you again in another heartwarming story.